My guest this afternoon is with the City University of New York Graduate Center, Lehman College. He is a professor of political science and a psychoanalyst. His most recent book, The Real Psychology of the Trump Presidency, was published by the Palgrave Macmillan Company, and a copy of this book can be accessed on the link for this video and our Facebook pages. Professor Stanley, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be asked. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. I'm very much happy to have you. You have written a lot of books, and I understand this is now your 18th book that you have written since you have started your career. Will you ever stop?
What's that? I don't think so. As long as I'm still interested in the work, I'll keep on writing. And, you know, to be interested in the psychology of the presidency is to have an area that's just incredibly interesting. Every president is unique. The country is in unique periods, and the interaction between the uniqueness of the presidency and the uniqueness of the country, you know, you can't help but be interested if you're a person with my particular perspective. So there I am.
That is wonderful. We do look forward to seeing more coming from you. Your book builds upon Stephen Skowronek's influential concept of political time and places President Donald Trump within the context of a preemptive president trying to become a reconstructive president by initiating a politics of American restoration. Can you explain the meaning of the concept of political time and its applicability to the American presidency?
Well, the idea of political time is simply this. The idea that there are periods in American history, that one period goes into another period. And what's important for the study of the presidency and also for American politics is there are some periods where people come together with a basic consensus, a basic understanding about where the country should be going and how it ought to go about getting there. And that's really what political time is about. But often, what happens in political time is that something happens which makes the dominant paradigm, the dominant understanding, start to scatter and not be very effective. And people begin to question whether or not we ought to go ahead on the basis that we've gone ahead before. And that starts the process of change. And what Skowronek does, which is a very important understanding, in addition to our understanding, is he tries to place presidents within those timeframes. Are you a president where everything is agreed upon? Are you a president where nothing is agreed upon? Are you a president where people are trying to get from, we used to agree, but now we need something new, and what's the new agreement going to be? So within all those quadrants, with all those spaces of political time, you have a president with a big problem to solve, which is, how do I fit into the evolution of the country's politics? And of course, every president wants to shape the country's politics in the direction of the ways in which he believes we ought to be going. So that's the basic idea of political time.
From a political science and psychoanalyst perspective, what key factors shaped Donald Trump's presidential leadership and governing style, let's say before and during his term of office, and what could have been the possible consequences?
Well, you know, any analyst worth his salt who's been trained will always look at a person's developmental history. They'll start in the family and they'll work up. You know, people don't stop living once they leave family life. They go on, they have a career, they learn how to do things in real life and so forth and so on. But for Donald Trump, as I was reading back on something that I had written, I thought about him as having had a father that he had to learn to stand up to, and a mother who loved him no matter what, unconditional love. And if you allow me, let me say a word about his father, who was not a tyrant, but he was an old-fashioned kind of guy. He had his very strict point of views, and you did things this way and you did things that way. And he had very strong views about what Donald ought to be doing and not be doing. And Donald was by his nature from the start rebellious. And so there was always a contest between his father's rules and his son's trying to stretch the boundaries. The other side of that about his mother, Mary, was something I didn't come to until really late in my study. I studied Trump for, 3 or 4 years, reading almost, every interview that he ever gave and so forth. And he said about his mother that I had a great mom. This was an interview on Mom's Day. He said, she loved me, which is probably not an easy thing to do. So he was aware of the fact that he wasn't the easiest guy to get along with. And she was so good to me, I couldn't do any wrong, which is a big problem, he thought. Maybe that's why I wound up the way I did, he said. I don't know, but I couldn't do any wrong in her eyes. And of course, Freud is the person who pointed us to the importance of unconditional love. A lot of love is conditional. Well, if you do this, if you go to that school, if you do this, you go there, if you date this girl or that guy or whatever the story is. But in Mary's eyes, Trump's mother's eyes, he could do no wrong. And it gives you a foundation that's unparalleled and also somewhat unique. And he needed it, honestly, because his father was a difficult guy and he had, rules. Let me tell you one story. Trump as an adolescent looked out on Manhattan from Queens. I don't know if you know much about the geography of New York, but there's Manhattan, which is, the big city. And then there's Queens, which is this little suburb that, Donald grew up in and so forth and so on. And he looked across at the skyscrapers and he thought to himself, I want to change the skyline. Now that is a big ambition for somebody who's 16 or 17, pretty heady stuff. And his father, who had this business, real estate business and so forth, said, Donald, that's not our kind of people over there. They're the big deals. We're not that way. We're steady people over here in Queens. Stay here and run the business. And so Donald had to have enough gumption, enough courage to essentially, cross the bridge, if you'll excuse the metaphor, and go over to Manhattan. And of course, when he got there, people laughed at him. They thought, some hick from Queens, what's he know? And that's what he's been doing all his life. So when I say that Trump had a father that he had to learn to stand up to and a mother who loved him, that's a pretty important start. And of course, standing up to people who don't want you to do what you want to do is a theme of Trump's life, from his father on through the presidency.
That is a very interesting insight. What would you consider to be the main points or highlights of chapter 4 that you decided to entitle Donald Trump's Fight Club Presidency? You provide in this chapter an interesting quotation that reads that the question naturally arises, what would President Trump do in response to the unprecedented opposition to his presidency's legitimacy and purposes? Would he ignore his critics and act presidential, or engage his enemies? And if so, how? The answer was not long in coming, and anyone familiar with Mr. Trump's history and psychology would not be surprised. He fought back hard, often in unprecedented ways, for an American president.
I think that's a fair statement and a true statement, and it's been both an advantage and a difficulty for Trump. He fought back ferociously, and of course, it comes from a lifetime of fighting back, first against his father, and secondly against the New York, Manhattan real estate moguls who said, well, he's not going to go anywhere or do anything. And he was in a very competitive business in New York, building skyscrapers. Everybody wanted to replace him and wanted to do it themselves. So he's had that fight spirit. You only get ahead by plunging ahead and, damn the torpedo, so to speak. So when he got to the presidency, I think he was pretty unprepared, believe it or not. There's some parts of Trump that are, believe it or not, are fairly naive. But he thought, he won the presidency, there would be a honeymoon period, which people ordinarily have. He had none. I mean, from the moment he announced his candidacy, it was 24/7, get rid of this guy. He's awful, terrible, and everything that followed from that. So I think he was unprepared. But his psychology is a psychology of somebody who doesn't lie down. He fights back. Trump's problem, and I think I thought more about where this comes from. He won't go after you if you don't go after him, but if you go after him, it's no holds barred. So he would go after people for things. I'm thinking of a couple of people who come to mind that he ran up against that he didn't like, and he would use disparaging personal terms. He would say of Carly, the woman who was going to be running against him, possibly, she had an ugly face, and who would look at that face? I mean, it's not the kind of thing you can or should or need to say. You could just say, I don't agree with her. She's not a good politician, or she won't be good in the presidency. Or McCain, who was, I studied McCain a bit. He was a war hero. He was shot down, and he behaved exemplary while in captivity. He was actually offered a spot to leave the Hanoi Hilton, they used to call it, where he was held in captivity early, and he refused it because he didn't think that he should go first. He wanted to wait until his fellow members there were let go first. So to me, the guy is a pretty outstanding guy. His politics, might be good or bad on this issue or that issue, but the idea of dissing him because he got shot down seemed to me to be egregious. And it's just an example of Trump not knowing when to put a period at the end of a sentence and let it go at that. And, that has been a big failing. And if I may, since we're on the subject of fight clubs, the opposition to Trump did something that was very smart early on. They went at him 24/7, and Trump, having not much in the way of impulse control for fighting back, went back after them 24/7. So the net result of that was a country that was fighting at every level almost all the time about everything. And people got very, very upset and tired. Americans don't like to fight. They want to get along with people. Why can't we just get along is a phrase you hear in some quarters. So they tired people out of Trump, and in part it's Trump's responsibility because he fought back the way he did. He could have been a hard fighter, but he could have put a comma or a period or a semicolon after a lot of what he did, and he would have been better off. I frankly don't know whether he has learned that lesson. If he has, he'll be a more effective candidate. You haven't asked, but I think he is going to be running.
Yeah.
So, we'll see what that happens, but he hasn't learned how to bridle it.
You have written extensively on presidential leadership and politics in the United States, and I believe you have some very good insights. Like I can see you have very, very interesting insights about this particular topic. If you were to look at it, at the Trump administration and his governance style, what key similarities and differences would you say you see between President Donald Trump and his predecessors? Can we really conclude that the United States has never had a president quite like Donald Trump?
I think that's a fair thing to say. For people who stand out like Trump stands out, and there are a couple in our pantheon that do stand out in my view, you can say of them, we've never had a president quite like X. It could be Lincoln, it could be George Washington, it could be FDR, it could be Ronald Reagan. Those are the people who, make a mark and distinguish themselves for a couple of reasons. One of them is that you have to remember that everyone who runs for president has an enormous amount of ambition. If you think that ambition, distinguishes presidential candidates, it doesn't. They are all up on the top. But what I've discovered in looking at what I'm writing about is that there are some presidents or candidates for president whose ambition is not only at the top, but above the top. They're the Obamas of the world who want to transform the whole country. They're the Trumps of the world who look over at the skyscrapers of New York and say, I want to change the skyline. That's a level of ambition that's quite different than a guy like George W. Bush, who's, the guy who found his life after 40 when he stopped drinking. he wanted to do a good job as president. That's thoroughly agreeable and admirable and okay to do. But that's different than I want to change the course of history. I want to bend the arc of history. So I'm actually now writing a book on presidential greatness. And I'll be looking at what happened post-Trump. And I'll be looking at people who aspired to greatness and made it. In my mind, that would be George Washington and Abe Lincoln and FDR. And I'll also look at people who aspired to it, but didn't make it. They would be people like Reagan, and they would be people like Barack Obama. And believe it or not, our current president, who, clearly has been bitten by the greatness bug and, aspires to be the next FDR and LBJ rolled in together, but, it's not happening. So that to me is very interesting. And, we'll see what happens. On the question of greatness, I would say that Joe Biden wants to be, an FDR or an LBJ, and Obama also said he wanted to be a great president. And for those people, the greatness element is a reflection of what they hope it will reflect on them. Mm-hmm. They will be great presidents, and therefore they are great. Trump is a little bit odd. If you think about it, I don't mean to be, a wag, but, Trump already thinks he's great. Mm-hmm. And, for him, the presidency doesn't make him great. He wants to, I think, try to do a lot of things for the country that I lay out in my book and we could talk mm-hmm. about. But I think he already thinks of himself as already having accomplished a lot and having less to do to make himself well. I know this runs absolutely counter to the Trump is a narcissist idea, mm-hmm. but it's where I come out, having taken a look at this for a couple of years.
A review of your book by William G. Mayer that appeared in the Political Science Quarterly notes that perhaps in reaction to the excesses of so many other analysts, Renshon to refer to you, often seems to far too indulgent of Trump's many behavioral flaws. And this includes an example that what is perhaps the most single common criticism of President Donald Trump's personality, that he is pronounced as a narcissist. Do you think that you may have been overly generous with your analysis of the president?
No, I think I was accurate. And what I tried to do in the book in some detail was distinguish between what I call and what other people in the field call ordinary narcissism and what other people call malignant narcissism. I'll just keep with that term. It's not a real DSM category term. But the idea is that almost everybody who wants to succeed in life has some degree of narcissism. You want to, do the things you do. You want to do them well. You want to be recognized for the things that you do well. I'm sure you want to do that. I want to do it. It's not unusual for people in our group or kind to want to do that. And in that respect, Trump is no different. So why all the other stuff? Well, I think people confuse two things. First of all, the idea that he's a malignant narcissist, which is trying to be a clinical term, is just it's just not accurate. And there, it's just a way of tarring him with a psychoanalytic brush, and it doesn't really hold much water. So why does he say things like "I'm the greatest" or "the greatest this" or "the greatest that"? That's Trump talk or Trump shtick. It's a Yiddish term, shtick. It means a way of dealing with the world, which is you get known for, but you don't really, that's really not what you think. It's a way of getting in and through and around the world. And it gives you, something that, people can associate with you. It's like a branding thing for Trump. Oh, Trump's the greatest, everything Trump wine, Trump glasses, Trump this, Trump that. And a lot of it is hooey and promotion. But a lot of, Trump is real accomplishment, and there's a lot of that there. And so you have to do the homework, and you have to get into the weeds, so to speak, if you'll excuse the term, and distinguish between, oh, my Trump steaks are the best steaks you'll ever taste and everything like that. And look at somebody who built all of the buildings on the Upper West Side in New York that are Trump Towers. It took 15 years to get all of those buildings built. It's a monumental accomplishment. And if you know anything about New York, building a storefront is not easy. So you can imagine what it's like to build those things. And he did it. He bided his time. He went from thing to thing and actually did very well in building up support over time. So there are both of those things. And don't confuse my steaks are great with a personality trait that's indelible. It's not the same thing.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, but thank you so much for your time. Viewers and listeners, this was Professor Stanley Renshon. He is with the City University of New York Graduate Center, Lehman College. He is a professor of political science and a psychoanalyst. His most recent book, The Real Psychology of the Trump Presidency, was published by the Palgrave Macmillan Company, and a copy of this book can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video and on our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook pages. Professor Stanley, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Have a good day.
You too.